I think we can get started now. I see quite a bit of our attendees ready. So welcome to This is Recruiting. Thank you so much for being here. If this is your first time joining us, This is Recruiting is a webinar series that we at HackerEarth have created, where we bring in the best in the industry to give you their stories and insights about relevant topics that are being discussed across the world today. And today we have a very interesting topic that in no way is new. It's something that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about quite frequently also. It's about quiet quitting. And we are talking about what hiring teams need to know about quiet quitting today. So if you are new to HackerEarth itself, we're basically matchmakers for tech and recruiters, and we help tech talent find their matches in the best companies across the world. We do this through a suite of products that we have created. We have assessment softwares that help you attract and source great talent, and it is completely skill-based. So we hire and help you hire by judging skill and skill alone. We also have a remote interviewing tool that helps you conduct interviews with technical talent developers while assessing their skills in real time. And finally, we have hackathons and hiring challenges to continuously engage and upskill your tech talent. So if you would like to know more about HackerEarth, or if you just like to talk about your problems in tech recruiting right now and discuss what are the best ways you can solve them, please do reach out to us through the link there. I have it also there in the chat. It's hackerearth.com/recruit. And we're going to be discussing a lot about, employee disengagement, engagement, and things like that. But without any further ado, let me introduce our incredible speaker for today. We have Crystal Lake, the CEO of GBS Worldwide, and who is also the co-host of Drive Through HR. She's done quite some incredible things. I mean, you can check her out on LinkedIn. She's got a great number of followers there. But I'm going to hand it over to you, Crystal. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
So thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I do run GBS. We are an employer branding, recruitment, marketing, and talent transformation firm. In addition, I am working on higher level research with the University of Wales around talent acquisition and talent attraction, and the gap between the traditional EVP and what that means for those with disabilities, which hidden disabilities, so neurodivergence, which is about 15 to 20% of the workforce, and other related talent topics, so employee engagement, talent management, that kind of thing. So we consult with companies around the world on that, which is great. And one of the things that are coming up more often than not lately is this concept of quiet quitting. So I'm very excited to talk to you about it today.
That's awesome. Thank you so much again for joining us, Crystal. And, given that you just told us so much about your experience and that you're dealing with, topics across the board, especially with employer branding, I think, it's good that we have that as a base to sort of structure our conversation around. Let's come to the main topic. We're talking about quiet quitting. And, why don't you give us a brief about what it is, and is it a new concept?
Quiet quitting is not a new concept. So, the term itself, quiet quitting, was that surfaced in APAC last year, 2021. There was a planking thing to show the frustration around employer expectations against what employees received in exchange for their efforts, and the expectations were not aligned with the remuneration around their jobs, and so. That's where that began. It picked up in the United States last spring, or maybe it was this spring, with someone in New York who was 21, who was like, hey, I'm here for this. I'm here for this idea of we shouldn't be doing more than what we're getting paid to do. And that really is employment. We hire people to do something in exchange for money, benefits, perks, et cetera, all of those things that we talk about in our EVPs. But the job description that we hand people when we're interviewing is what they're paid to do. So quiet quitting is really just saying, we're going to do what you hired us to do. So for a company, it's an equity issue, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. But for the individual, it's really about divorcing, and then this came from NPR, so these are not my words, but they're beautiful. I think it's the best definition I've seen of this. It's divorcing your ego from what you do for a living and not striving for perfection, but rather to do your job. So you're setting boundaries and you're completing the tasks that are required of you that are in your job description within the time and in the payment that's allotted for that. And that's it, right? That's it. So that's a really foreign concept for America. That's not the talent model that we've been built on.
Right.
And I think that's where the struggle is.
Yeah, but I think it's, not just America. I mean, speaking from someone coming from like an APAC country, this is also something that, we are not built for either. People are just struggling to accept the fact that, you want to establish boundaries. I think the minute you say boundaries, people are a little skittish about the entire topic, whether it's, establishing boundaries when it came to, say, workplace boundaries, now work-life balance itself. And I wanted to know, is this a concept that's across industries, or is it very industry specific? Like, do you see it just happening with, say, tech industries, or is it something that's known everywhere?
Yeah, no, it's not one industry. It's across industries. And part of that is the talent model. Now, it's not across all geographies, right? So it's not in every country. It's not an issue in all countries equally, right? And I think that's where we go back to. There are countries like America, but certainly not only America, whose talent model is built on the concept of more, right? And so in America, we've really worked around the same talent model since World War II. And the problem with that is that model is breaking down. And Cord and Ferry did a study on this that showed that like we're in the worst talent crunch that we've been in 20 years. And it's not simply because of the pandemic. That's really easy. I've seen a lot of articles that talk about, well, quiet quitting is a byproduct of the pandemic. Not really. So quiet quitting is, as it's termed, is certainly exacerbated by the pandemic. But the problem is really the model that we're expecting that we work off of doesn't work, because what we're doing is we're saying, hey, or employers have an equity issue. So they're saying like, hey, we want you to do this job that we hired you to do, plus all of these other responsibilities that weren't in this job description, because they're really probably for another role that we've either not hired for, or it isn't getting done by someone we have hired because they're underperforming. So we need you to pick up the slack. There's been this expectation that in order to prove yourself worthy of promotions and raises and even keeping the job for which you were hired, you need to go above and beyond the job description that you were given. And it's not sustainable indefinitely. And that's breaking down. And so we're seeing as a result of that, people saying, wait a minute, you've been talking, employers, you've been talking about work-life balance and how you provide that, but you don't. And so really the opposite of this whole work-life balance, the opposite response to it is quiet quitting. It's a negative rebranding of the work-life balance that workers are not receiving across industries.
Right. Building off of what you said about the pandemic itself, I think, so this was one of our, questions that we also received, because I think the common misconception is that quiet quitting means employee disengagement. And this is something that, even I myself thought that it was the same thing and it was kind of similar at one point. But what do you think it actually means? And does it actually connect to employee disengagement? And if not, how is it different?
So I won't say it's completely divorced from disengagement, but I think it is important that we know this is not an engagement issue, because quiet quitting is saying we're going to engage with the job for which we were hired to do during the time which we were told it would take to do it. Right. And so there is a level of engagement there. So what we're really looking at is the response to an inequitable relationship in employment, which has existed forever, right? Like we'd like to say that employment is equitable. It is not. Like a company offers an individual employment, right? The employee has to accept or not, the candidate has to accept or not that offer of employment, but it's still fully on the employer's side. Like somebody can't just walk up and say, I work here now. Like that's not how that works, right? So employment is an inequitable proposition. And there is a response to that. But Gallup did a survey about quiet quitting. And what we found is that like the engagement levels haven't really changed that much. So in most groups, we'll talk about one group in a minute, but in most age groups, the engagement is pretty consistent. And so this isn't a response to how engaged one is or is not within their responsibility. It's extra role responsibilities that are at play here. And so when we're looking at extra role responsibilities, what that is the willingness someone has to be able to assume responsibilities into their self-identity at work that don't belong to them. And that has shrunk. And as far as what should be the first response to that, I think the first response employers need to look at is how are you staffing your organization? Are you staffing appropriately for what you need to get done? And if the answer to your staffing model is we're going to need everybody to do a little bit more, then you need to look at changing those responsibilities and appropriate compensation for the effort that you expect your employees to put in. Otherwise, you run the risk of this quiet quitting or, basically refusal to take on those responsibilities, which employees should be within their right to do.
Right, exactly. And sorry, go on.
No, that's okay. So before we go away from this, though, there is one population that has dropped pretty significantly in terms of engagement, and that's those under the age of 35.
Okay.
Interesting about that. And their engagement points dropped by 6 points over 2019 to 2022. So if you look at the course of basically the pandemic, there is a larger disengagement with that population. And part of that might be by seeing the way that people were treated throughout the pandemic. Like you're looking at largely a population that watched their parents go in under the Jack Welch model and subsequent models that says, do more, do more, do more, be willing to give, more than to be average, to be accepted, not even to really get ahead. And so they watched their parents do these things and not come out like Jeff Bezos or super successful or even the heads of their own companies, right? They just kept their jobs and became mid-level managers that worked tons of hours. And for a lot of people under 35, I'm going to say the younger generation, I'm not that much older than this generation, but I am a little bit older than it. And for that generation, they didn't see the payoff for their parents. They didn't see the payoff for their older siblings. They didn't see the payoffs for their families and friends. And so they're not willing to do it. Like they're very much a work to live and not a live to work generation. And I'm here for it. I think that's fantastic.
It's so nice to hear you say that, because I think the contrary opinion, or I'd say at least the most popular opinion based on what I've been seeing across my LinkedIn feed so far, is just, Gen Z and millennials are just all about not wanting to work enough. You have, people who are still talking about working, say even 18 hours or 20 hours in a day, because they think that, in the beginning of your career, you have to like grind and hustle and be there continuously just to prove your worth. And building off what you said as well, I think, at least I'm not sure about the US, but I know in India, like one of the most common things you see on a resume is I'm a proactive person. I will take up things that are not in my job description. I'm super proactive that way. And it's nice to know that, we're finally coming out of that we're not looking at continuing in that same line of thought. The proactiveness can mean more than just the proactiveness can mean more than just, taking up things that are not in your line of work.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly can. I think, my opinion may not be reflective and probably is not reflective of the majority of CEOs in the world. It doesn't have to be, right? But I do think that whether we share the same opinion or not, CEOs and leaders across organizations are going to have to deal with the fact that they cannot control or dictate the level of engagement an employee is willing to do. And interestingly enough, in some markets, in some talent markets, in some waves of the socioeconomic models, like you can dictate a little more what someone is going to put in, because you have the ability to say, like, do it or you're fired, right? But we have an incredibly low unemployment rate. And so that unemployment rate actually strengthens employees' ability to say, like, yeah, enough of how I'm being treated, enough of giving my life to a company who would replace me the day after I left, the day after I died, if I wasn't able to do enough. And I think that's okay, right? Like, it's okay to an extent for an employee to be able to say, like, this is what I was hired to do. And en masse to be able to say, this is what we're willing to do, because it's not like employers can't appropriately respond to it. They absolutely can. So I know I don't want to get too far ahead of our questions, but there is a solution for employers. And part of that is looking at your staffing models and being more realistic about what the output in each role should be. And if you have expected too much out of a role, which you can see based off of the performance in that role and the people that have been in that role over time, then you need to add more positions. And that's more expensive, and it does reduce profit, but it also manages a productivity problem that employers have. So right now, employers are dealing with significantly lower levels of productivity than they did pre-pandemic. It's not simply because of quiet quitting. It's also because of things like supply chain problems, and, availability of parts, contracts that are just now re-ramping back up after the pandemic, et cetera. There's a lot of things that go into that. But if they want to tackle the productivity issue, they need to be willing to staff according to the productivity levels that they need.
And of course, talking a little bit more about that, what do you think are the repercussions? Say employers do not want to pay attention to this, or would rather continue to work on the same model, build off the same thing, and maybe just hire more people who they think would fit that particular culture of just wanting to work more. Or maybe even, like you said, right, people over the age of 35 whose engagement hasn't dropped significantly, maybe people who are still willing to hold on to jobs, or of course everyone's willing to hold on to jobs, but people who are less flexible, or not so open to establishing boundaries right now.
So I think a couple of things to address what you just said. You can look at focusing your hiring in on that age groups that haven't really dropped significantly engagement. You're going to lead to a succession problem at that point, right? So you're trading one issue in for another. You'll have a short-term gain for a very long-term negative impact. So I don't think that's really the solution in the long term. It may be a very short-term, get us over this particular hump or get us through these particular goals that we have to be able to reach to stay healthy as an organization. But long-term, you're going to have to adjust for the mentality of a group that's not going to go away. The people that are under 35 aren't going to disappear in the market or suddenly go, oh, okay, well, now I have to go do it this other way. They're, if anything, because of the psychological impacts that have led them to this particular work outlook to begin with, it'll just reinforce what they already feel, which is that there is no loyalty in employment. So I don't think the solution is to shy away from them. I think the solution is to learn how to work with them and get what you need in a way that isn't at the expense of the individual worker. So that's one thing. On the other side of it, you talk about repercussions. Perhaps a better word is consequences. And we talk about this a lot. I have a teenage son that is a stepson that is autistic, and he's wonderful, and I love him. But we have had to, in raising him, look at the definition of consequence, right? And so I grew up with consequences being a negative thing. But the reality, consequence is an outcome, right? So it's neither good nor bad, it's an outcome. And so when we look at the consequences of quiet quitting as just an outcome-based thing, I think what we have to look at is it's not so much about attrition as it is about focus and equity. And so the great thing for companies is like, if you don't, let me back up. If you don't address it, the problems that you're going to lead into is that they won't leave. They just won't give you what you need because they have this inequitable relationship. So you will either have to do layoffs to be able to come in and get people that, you do need. Because if they're doing what they're supposed to do, you can't, I guess you could, but you shouldn't fire someone for doing their job. Right? Like, I'm going to pause there because it's so absurd. Like, you shouldn't fire someone for doing their job. But organizations, and there will be some that do it, will lay people off or remodel the job in such a way that it constructively discharges the people that they don't want to keep. And so then we'll bring in some new people. So that's one possible consequence. That consequence has some very negative outcomes for the for the workers that remain. It will suppress engagement levels and productivity levels, and it will also destabilize your reputation in the marketplace. So don't recommend that. The other consequence or outcome of this that actually could be a really positive thing is for employers to relook at how equity is managed within their organization. And equity doesn't have to simply be shares, though it certainly can include, financial compensation and shares and things like that. But, you can look at creating more performance-based compensation models that are tied to KPIs with the company and not simply within the role. That it's been done for years. It's not a new concept. It has mixed results. It could be good within the organization. It depends on what kind of culture your organization has and how you manage performance and the value of high performance within your overall value proposition. So that there actually are some positive outcomes that can come from this. It's all in how you choose to focus as an organization or within talent. For people that are working in recruiting and talent acquisition, I would say, putting an extra focus around high performance individuals is probably appropriate, but you have to be careful if you don't have a high performance culture right now, bringing in a significant number of hires who are very high performance driven, who are very extra role motivated, can upset the balance of your current culture, which is also destabilizing. So everything has to be done mindfully and over time.
And can you give me like an example of, tying KPIs to, a better performance and how you dealt with it at least before? Do you follow the same thing right now? Is that something that's practiced in your organization?
Sure. So now we have a much smaller organization, right? So boutique agencies that have under 50 employees, definitely different than organizations with 50, 100,000 people, right? So you do have to look at the scale. But in our organization, yeah, absolutely. If we meet things before deadline, there are bonuses associated with that. If we are able to, when we are able to retain clients at the same level of service or greater, then there are bonuses associated with that. We also, though, look at our tenants. Like at GBS, we have a tenet around work-life balance that is really important to the organization because I believe in employee well-being. So our organization is structured to work more 4 days a week.
Oh,
but every week there's that fifth day is off. So we're going to do more, Tuesday through Friday, and Monday we're going to be off 1 week. The next week we're going to do more Monday through Thursday, but we're going to be off on Friday. So it allows our team to be able to recharge, refocus, and actually live, right? And not just try to figure out how to fit all of the things they need to do within a couple of hours of each day. They have a whole day that's backing up to or coming off of a weekend to be able to enjoy more of their life.
That's incredible to hear, actually. That and it's not just so. Just to clarify on that, so you don't have one particular day off in a particular week. So it's each time it's just changing every time.
Well, everybody has Saturday and Sunday off. Now we may have to every once in a while pop on to deal with a client need or something like that. And again, that can be handled through bonuses and things like that. I do think if you ask people to do extra things, you should give extra in return. But on top of those 2 days a week, it's a floating day, basically. So it's alternating Fridays and Mondays. So 2 Fridays off a week, 2 Mondays off a week to create 4-day weekends.
That's
right. 3-day weekends and every other once or twice a month, I have to look at a calendar, but a couple of times a month, it seems like we have a 4-day weekend.
That's actually really great. I mean, I think a lot of people were talking about, 3-day weekends for a while during the pandemic. And at least I didn't hear of any, significant organizations moving forward with it. I didn't see a lot of things, where it was actually implemented or hear the success stories after. So it's great to know that, at least at GBS, that's going well.
Yeah. So I think the biggest challenge for us is actually in the leadership level. We're probably the least likely to follow it, but as a whole, like, we do recommend it. We try to keep to it. We forget now and again, everybody does, right? But I think the point is not so much like, hey, you have to be off on Friday or you have to be off on Monday. It's, get your stuff done so that you have time to be able to go and enjoy your life. And if that Friday, Monday schedule works out, great. There's been someone on our team who said, like, hey, that doesn't really work for me. I just need a floating day each week. And it may be Friday, it may be Monday, it may be Tuesday. I don't know. That's fine. Whatever. Get your stuff done. Go do what you need to do. It's the same concept. It's along the same lines with unlimited PTO, right? Like, right. You hire adults that are competent to be able to do whatever it is that you need done. Trust them to do it. Like, we don't need to babysit every hour that they're off the clock or on the clock. If you do, you probably have the wrong person in that role. And so that's really the point at GBS that we try to focus on. And I think it's worked really well with our team. That's
incredible to hear. But so moving on to our next question. Given that, you've done a lot of work in employer branding, I think, so this is, again, one of the questions that we had in our recruiter community coming in, because so we did a webinar earlier as well about employer branding and creating like an employer brand that sticks with people. So given, this was something we did during the pandemic, but post the pandemic and in the wake of quiet quitting, do you think there are things that people need to change in their EVP? Are there, do people need to explicitly mention that we are hiring you to do just your job and no more? And how exactly do the hiring teams need to go about that?
Yeah. So again, I want to be careful to know that this isn't really a new phenomenon per se. Like, employee engagement has been a thing for a really long time. It's just new branding. Right. So we've rebranded the concept of and tied together the concept of employee engagement levels with work-life balance. But there's certainly a new and heightened focus on it. And that's because of a voracious media that is always looking for something new to sensationalize. Right. And so this is here. And also social media. Like, what I think is really new is the way employees are branding and voicing their tolerance for the things that they experience at work, right? So I think to take advantage of that would be in companies' best interests. And so what that really comes down to is that shift in focus to employee well-being, right? So if you want to look at employer branding, we're going to tap back into employee value proposition. And one of the values that converges between an organization and an individual is well-being. And so if you shift your focus into well-being, what do you as an employer facilitate in your employees' lives? And so what I mean by that is, what is an employee able to do because they work for you? And that might be really fascinating work as a component, but I think the bigger shift needs to be in, what do you enable? Do you enable them to travel? Do you enable them to have an extra day off a week so that they can go and do whatever they need to do or want to do? How do you enable them to be able to experience their life outside of your organization? So yes, you should always have an anchor and a tap back into your work experience. That's important. But if the focus on this is, hey, employers, we want to be able to live, which is very much, I think, the overarching message around quiet quitting from an employee perspective, then employers should be showing how they enable that. And fair pay is a massive component of that, right? Like, there's a really interesting thing when we think about, there are countries, and most countries have minimum employment compensation levels, right? So, my brain just broke. I forgot the term, but basically minimum salaries, the minimum compensation. So minimum wage. Sorry, my brain just broke. But so minimum wage. A lot of countries have this, not all. But what minimum wage is really saying is if we could pay, if your federal government, if your systems of government have to enforce a minimum wage, what they're saying, what an employer is saying when they use that minimum wage is if we could pay you less, we probably would. But this is what we're required to pay you. That's a horrible branding message, right? Like it's horrible. So, I mean, it's appropriate maybe if you have no work experience, but outside of that, people want living wage. They want to have a wage that allows them to be able to have a home or a dwelling that is theirs, that they don't have to have 4 roommates to be able to afford. They want to be able to do things, have hobbies, have a transportation, like normal stuff. Right. So you don't want to be the company that goes around like touting hey, you make enough to be able to have a studio apartment by yourself. Like that is not winning in employer branding. But I do think you can take a cue from some really large organizations. Deloitte's a great example. It's an old campaign. I point to it for different things for years, but First Year Wisdom was a really fascinating campaign that Deloitte put out for a whole lot of reasons. But one of the things that they did was rather than focus on just the components of the job is they focused on where their employees, their first year employees, were able to fit in the things that they liked in their life. Now, if you pay really close attention to that video, you'll see a woman doing yoga at like 10 o'clock at night and a guy going surfing before 7 in the morning, because that's when they could fit it in across the like truly horrendous work hours that you have to put in Big Four. And I say horrendous with, I'm not an accountant. I'm not in accounting. I'm not in finance. Like that's not my world. You put in those hours for a few years and the payoff that those people get is it sets them up for the rest of their career. Yeah. There's a value to it, right? There's a benefit. And I think Deloitte does a really good job of explaining that benefit overall. But in this specific campaign, they focused on barbecue grilling and yoga and surfing and other things that were interests in people's life. They showed the whole being of someone. And I think employers need to do more of that, especially in response to this specific issue.
So with your background in, recruitment marketing, and I can see that quite a bit with the talk about the campaign of Deloitte and everything, how do you think employers should showcase that they're more focused on employee well-being without it being too performative? I think sometimes, it does come off as, okay, yeah, we are just very focused on this person, or like here, you can see people doing yoga in our office, and that's why employee well-being. And I think quite a lot of times it does come off a little bit as put on. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, how would you go about it?
Storytelling. So since the dawn of time, we have imparted messages, wisdom, warnings, warnings aren't necessarily related here, but everything that we wanted to know, knowledge, has been passed through stories. And so when we look at employer branding and how to be able to share these things without coming off as too performative, I think you let your employees do your talking. And you can come up with topics. So, we're working with an organization right now on creating the content around their employer value proposition pillars, which is important. Like your content should be tied to who you are, both individually and as an organization. So we want to be able to share the stories of our employees within the context of what we're able to provide due to the work experience they'll have as part of the organization. So I think you can give a topic. And in this instance, it might be like, what are you able to do because you work at XYZ, or as a result of the compensation you receive for the effort that you put in? What is that enabled in your life? And then just let them talk and share those stories. And some of them will be great and some of them will be corny, and that's okay. I think one thing that the pandemic should have taught us is that as people, we connect with people. And we should have known that before. Like, this is not a new lesson, folks, at all, in any way, shape, or form. But we connect best with other people. We don't want to hear the words of solidarity from a brand. We want to hear from their people. And so, whether that's sharing their dogs at work or their cats or whatever your favorite kind of pet is. I have grandchildren, so that they do more damage than any pet. So, that's all we have. But whatever that is, whether it's sharing your pets or your passions or your interests, your favorite books, the exercise you do, whatever it is that makes you as an individual, HackerEarth should let you share that. As the head of GBS, I should be encouraging my employees to share the same. Like, we should all encourage our employee groups to share what they're able to do as a result of being part of our organization. And sometimes that will be work related and sometimes that will not, but that's balance and that's good.
That's actually a very helpful tip. I think it also gives, obviously when you're hearing from employees directly, there is that authenticity and it's very evident there for sure. Okay, so I think, we come to our final question, and then just reminding everyone that you can put in your questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom panel if you have any questions about quiet quitting or employer branding or anything we've discussed so far. And we will take it up at the end of the webinar. Coming to our last question before we get to some of the older audience questions there that I've been getting. What has been your experience with quiet quitting and how have you dealt with it? And this is, both in your organization as well as, the organizations that you work with, the ones that you're consulting with, or how you're telling them to be more aware, apart from just, refocusing on their talent model or refocusing on employee well-being itself. How have you dealt with it so far?
Yeah, that's I saw that question come in as we were preparing for this webinar. I was like, oh, what am I going to say here? Because we haven't had a lot of experience with it inside of our organization, but that's not to say we haven't had any. So what we have had is some of the precursors that you might see to what would ultimately be quiet quitting. And what I mean by that is we are taught, it is ingrained, I think, within us as workers, to overestimate what we're able to provide and deliver. Right? Because we want to seem like we're good employees. So I'm going to tell you I can put in 20 hours when I can really put in 10. That doesn't make someone a bad person. Like, they're trying to be earnest. They're trying to be there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can deliver. And so in our organization, like for me, and I think I can speak for my leadership team in the same way. We've had conversations with employees and team members where it's like, hey, I don't need you to tell me what you think I want to hear. I need you to tell me what you can do. What's reasonable for you? Is that 10 hours a week? Is that 50 hours a week? Like, what do you want to do? And then what can you actually do? Not what do you think I want you to do? And that's reprogramming, right? Like, that is not what corporate America teaches. And so, that's really been a lot of our experience with it, is trying to reframe expectations. That, hey, we don't have unrealistic expectations of you, but we do need to have realistic expectations from you. And for there to be equity, then you have to be able to tell us what's reasonable for you. And we need to be able to tell you if that's reasonable against what we need to deliver. And then if it's not, like, the way that you create psychological safety for those kind of questions is making sure in those conversations that are very crucial to have, is to make sure they understand, like, their job's not like what you're looking at is a staffing conversation. So if, for example, an employee that was hired into a full-time role, you don't think that they're actually putting in full-time hours or effort, right? Maybe it's not going to them and saying like, hey, we can't have you here. Maybe it's would you function better in a part-time role? If so, how can we convert that and then bring someone else in part-time to be able to make up those difference? Now, that's a really complex organizational conversation to have before you can have it at an individual level, right? Your systems have to be set up to accommodate that. Ours are. So, we can have those kind of conversations. So that's from an organizational perspective, that's how we dealt with it. But I have two other stories that I want to share, one from that under 35 group and then one from myself. Also, when I was under 35. So when I was running HR for the first time, I was fully unprepared for that role. And so I had to do, like, I was hired to be the head of talent acquisition. And my first week on the job, I was told by the CEO, oh, by the way, you now run HR, right? Because that CEO had no real understanding of HR, right? Otherwise would know that I was woefully unqualified to be able to perform that. But it was now my job. So I had to go learn a lot of things very quickly. Thank goodness for organizations that I was able to get memberships into and learn quite a bit rather quickly. But that's a lot of hours, right? And so for me, like if I was working less than 80 hours a week, it was just a feat, right? It was wonderful. And I didn't realize how much I was working until my birthday. And my parents and my daughters had taken me out for my birthday to a local restaurant because I didn't have time to go to the place that we all really liked to go to. And while I was at dinner, my CEO had called me no less than 5 times. It was already like 8 o'clock at night.
My God.
Right. And kept calling, kept texting, kept going. And my father finally said, like, this is a job. Like, this is a job that is interfering with your life. And you're never going to get these moments back. Like, they're just never going to come back again. So you need to decide when to be present at work and when to be present in the rest of your life. And no one had had that conversation with me, right? Because employers don't generally, at least at that point, hadn't really shown any interest in your life outside of the confines of their walls. Right. Mine certainly did not. And so, I had to step back and look at like, do I want to miss my children's birthdays? Do I want to miss my birthdays? Do I want to miss these family moments? And the answer was a resounding no. I quit the next week. So, because when I had that conversation with my boss was like, well, this is just what we need. And it wasn't going to change. Okay, well, then it wasn't the right place for me. I knew I could leave and go find something else. Not everyone is as lucky, right? Not everyone knows there's another job waiting right there for them. But just because they don't know that doesn't make it okay for an employer to take advantage of that. Right. And so, and because that's happened over and over again, and my story is in no way unique, we have this new branding by employees, this new way of branding the "I've had enough" statement, right? So there's that piece. The other is from my daughter, my youngest daughter. She actually does great within her organization. She's had wonderful performance reviews and raises, et cetera. But she is one of those people that is very clear on her work-life boundaries. Right. Like, so she's going to put in the effort that she was hired to do. She's going to stop when that's done, and she gets her job done, and she gets it done within the time she's supposed to. And then she's done. And that's it. And when she told me about that, I was like, oh, okay. How are they handling that? Like, are you concerned at all about your continued employment? And she was like, no, Mom, I'm not, because if they don't appreciate that, someone else will. Like, someone else will get it, but I shouldn't have to give up my life to have a job. Like, we watched you work all of the time and you didn't have a life, and we don't want to do that. And she was talking about her and her sister. And that hurts, by the way, as a parent, to hear like, oh, that's what you got out of all of those hours, right? It wasn't like look at all the things I'm doing to facilitate your life. It was like, yeah, you were never able to be fully there. And I want to be fully there in my life. So I was really proud of her, as hard as that was for me to hear. I was really proud of her at under 25 to be able to have learned that lesson, to be able to have decided for herself, like what's okay for her in her life and what is not. And so I, in having further conversations with her and her sister about it, like a lot of their friends saw their parents give all and just not got enough back. And they don't want to do that. That's not how they want to live their life. And I'm really, not to sound condescending, but I'm really proud that they're able to look at themselves, and even without the benefit of experience or years of expertise to be able to craft themselves as someone that's indispensable, they recognized everyone's dispensable. And therefore, I'm going to create a life I love. Work is part of that, but my life is not work. And that's wonderful.
Those are incredible stories to hear. And I think, I completely relate to the fact that, we have grown up watching our parents put in those hours. And like you mentioned right at the beginning as well, people have been putting it in, haven't reached the level where you thought they would because of all those hours of work. I have one question here that's come into me. So I think it's not really tying into whatever we discussed right now, but a lot of people have spoken about how larger organizations might have a little bit more structure and a more defined role, but whereas startups don't. Startups have, a more flexible thing. The job descriptions are not well written there. Sometimes people expect you to go above and beyond what you'd normally need to do in your particular role. And there it comes back to the same thing of this is what we expect you to do. But do you think there's a way for startups to improve that culture?
Oh, certainly. I mean, not every startup is you're going to live your life inside of our walls, right? So part of that is, and maybe for startups, part of that is showing all of the different places that you can work, right? So I worked with a startup in 2015-ish, that one of the things that they did was they took a bunch of pictures of their employees working in all of these fun places, like the lake, the beach, on planes traveling to fun, what we would assume would be fun and exotic locations. I don't actually know. It could be like Idaho. But wherever it was that they were going, right, they showed them like, yeah, their laptops or their cell phones, their smartphones were out. And that was kind of interesting to see, like, yeah, we don't care where you work, you do you, but make sure you're getting your stuff done. Again, it all comes back to an issue of equity. So, for a startup that may not be well-defined, whose roles may be very quickly shifting, how are you providing equity across those shifts? And setting that tone up front of like, hey, this is what we think you're being hired for today. As we grow, we may see that your role actually needs to be something different. And as that comes, be willing to then have a conversation around what needs to change in terms of compensation or in balance or in actual equity. I mean, one massive advantage to startups over a very large enterprise organization is that you can give and change your equity stakes much easier than a well-defined company, like not well-established companies that are past their growth rounds. So, those would be the conversations that I would have to be able to continue to attract the level of talent that you need without making them feel like you're taking advantage.
I think that's super helpful. And given that I think we do have quite a lot of startups here on the call today as well, because especially our Indian audience, we have a lot of startups coming in. I think that's important for them to know, especially how to have those conversations as you're growing. So building off of that, we have another question here. If we see an employee quiet quitting, that's doing well in existing roles, but also expecting growth and promotion in the future, how do you address the growth issue, since moving up to a bigger role requires more energy, effort, etc. in the job?
So I think microfeedback is a wonderful thing. I'm actually not a huge fan of annual performance reviews because by the time you have the conversations about their performance, most of your points are probably so far gone that that's not going to be impactful. Feedback, most of it won't be impactful because it's too far removed from the event. So if you're going along and having small conversations along the way, and reinforcing how well they're doing in the existing role, it also gives you, or not, right? Like maybe it's, hey, you're doing what you need to do here, and that's great. What are your goals? Like, do you want to stay in this role? Do you want to be promoted? For promotions, this is what we need to see, or this is what we expect to see. In exchange, we're willing to give you this. And again, there's a lot of inequity in employment where employers expect that an employee is going to front load all of the effort in hopes, like really they're trading on hope that there will be an exchange for some future performance, right? Whether that's from the company, whether that's a promotion or a bonus or whatever. So what I would say specifically in startup environments, but I think this can be addressed in larger organizations as well, look at trying to balance that exchange. And so, hey, we're going to need you to do more here. Like, here's what we're going to give you to be able to do that. We're going to be a little more flexible with your time, or you can do some hybrid working, or, at the end of every month, you're going to see this much in incentive compensation. I'm a huge fan of performance-based compensation models. So, but I don't think they should be too far removed from the actual performance because it decreases the motivation output from it. So I think you can do those kind of things to help them continue to be motivated to want to move up. Now, if the issue is like, yeah, moving up requires more energy and effort, et cetera, and also we don't have that role, and so we want to make sure that they're not demotivated because there's no place to move them to. Remember, employment is largely an equity conversation. Like it just is. It's an equity experience and it's an equity conversation. Equity comes in many forms. So a promotion is definitely one of the ways that we can create a more equitable relationship in employment, but it's certainly not the only way. And by having conversations with your employees around what's important to them, which is not going to be cookie cutter across the board, then you can find ways to be able to give them equitable response to the effort that you need from them.
I think it makes perfect sense. I think I hope that answers your question. Who was an anonymous question that was put in, but yeah, I think that is something that a lot of people probably have it in their mind that at least the traditional way to rise up the ranks is slowly taking up more work. But I don't think a lot of people have thought about it from the perspective that, hey, an employer also wants you to rise, but they will probably give you the freedom or give you like that space to grow without overburdening you at the same time. And that's probably a new concept that everyone needs to kind of get in their head.
Yeah, but let's touch on that for just a second if we have the time.
We do have some time.
Okay, they don't necessarily want you to move up. Not everyone, certainly. Like, because employment is a triangle, right? So like we need a lot of people in the individual contributors and low level management layers to be able to make everything work. And so I would invite the attendees to look at their own careers, but also the careers within their organization as more of a lattice mobility experience than a ladder. Right. And so rather than pushing the narrative of you need to move up to be successful, maybe it's more of pushing a narrative of you need to be well-rounded to be successful. So you need to understand your role. And when you fully understand your role and you've given what you can to this role and you don't feel like there's more space to grow here, and we agree that there's not more space to grow here, then we should look at putting you in other roles, cross-training you into other positions to expand your knowledge base, to make you more well-rounded. That may look like, instead of promoting up, it may look like, sending them to be able to get more education, to be able to do more. Or like, again, these should be goals that are crafted between the individual and the organization to make sure that it fits both sides. That's equitable decision-making. But I know for me in my own career, like there was a point in time where I would have given anything to an organization that was willing to send me to go get higher education. Like that would have been huge for me. I didn't work for those organizations, but that was what I wanted. I didn't care about a promotion. I wanted more knowledge. So that would have been satiating to me. And I think if you look at your employees and in your, you should have some sort of method of being able to understand their learning and development goals, looking at that and focusing in on that as a way to grow up, as opposed to simply a title promotion or a role promotion. That's very helpful too. And then compensating on that additional knowledge, right? So that it's something that employees want to do.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, we are a little bit out of time, but if anyone has any more questions, you can always hit us up on the email that you got the webinar invite on. You can send it to me at rebecca@hackerearth.com. We will also be doing, a couple more sessions on the same topic. If you're interested, please fill in our survey form to let us know what topics you'd like to see in future webinars as well. Crystal, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a super insightful session. To be very honest, I did not know the time had just flown by. I can't believe it's been an hour already. Thank you so much for all the insight that you've given us in this entire thing. I think it was a lot to, discuss. I think we covered a wide variety of topics. We went from quiet quitting to recruitment marketing to employer branding and almost everything in between. And I think, your stories have just made this webinar all the more interesting. I can already see, the great positive reviews coming in. I think you can see them too if you look at the question box there. But yeah, thank you so much. We loved having you here, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. To everyone here, again, thank you so much for coming in. Please do fill in our survey form. Please answer it and tell us what you like about the webinar and what are some of the topics you'd like to see in the future.